we live in an incredibly neurotoxic environment. And we've kind of stumbled into this. Nobody really knew that so many of the toxins in our environment affect the brain like they do and reduce the neurogenic rate. So smog, for example, most of the world's population lives in smoggy areas.
Let's ditch the quick fix and dive into today's conversation. Welcome, everybody. My guest today is Dr. Brant Cortright. Dr. Cortright is a professor emeritus with the California Institute of Integral Studies. He's an author and a clinical psychologist. He has written 4 books, 2 #1 international Amazon bestsellers, Functional Psychology for Anxiety, Depression, and Cognitive Decline, as well as the Neurogenesis Diet and Lifestyle. Dr. Cortright is a featured speaker at conferences and corporate gatherings on the topics of peak brain performance, cognitive enhancement, preventing cognitive decline, anxiety, and depression. He sees psychotherapy clients in his San Francisco office, and Dr. Cortright's orientation is holistic and integral, and he integrates the 2 major streams of depth therapy, contemporary psychodynamic and existential humanistic approaches, together with somatic and functional approaches to psychological healing and growth. Welcome, Dr. Cortright. Happy to have you here today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes. So would love to get into quite a few of basically the intro there, but I'd like you to just kind of maybe share a little bit more of your history on becoming holistic, integrative, or has it always been holistic and integrative, or what was your journey to where you are today?
Pretty much always. I mean, I entered psychology through yoga and philosophy and started in the time when the human potential movement was getting started, and was initially drawn to somatic and Gestalt therapy and some of these very, very holistic approaches. So that's really always been my interest, is really looking at body, heart, mind, spirit. You know, that we are multidimensional beings. We exist on these different levels. We're all one being, but we have different frequencies or different vibrations. And so to include all of them has always seemed pretty important to me.
Oh, I totally agree. I couldn't, as you think about how amazing the body is, when you think of body, mind, soul, spirit, and we're going to touch on the mind, every one of those areas of life are very complex. Mm-hmm. So the brain specifically, as we're going to get into some brain health, how do you define peak brain performance?
I see that as really most people are operating below what they actually could be operating at.
Okay.
I think that there is a kind of general neurotoxic environment that we're living in right now that reduces or erodes our brain capacity. But at the same time, we've also learned a lot about actually how to improve brain function and how to be firing on all cylinders, so that we are more creative, we learn faster, we have some kind of different types of cognitive enhancement, right? Different parts of the brain can be operating at higher levels, and also interpersonally as well, because a big part of our brain is emotional and interpersonal. We can be operating, I mean, this is really what the human potential movement has been about from the very beginning, that we have greater potential than we are actually actualizing. And to be able to live at that higher level, at a higher plateau, has been really kind of the quest for much of the human potential movement. And I think that some of the new brain health studies and research add another dimension to this that has really been missing from the more purely psycho-spiritual approaches up till now.
So it's kind of, as you touch on that, it's I think what's happened to a lot of people, and I don't know what your experience has been, but it's kind of a drip effect, that we don't realize how much potential we have lost or how much potential we could gain, right?
That's absolutely right. It's death by 1,000 cuts. We don't notice 1 or 2 or even 20 or 30, but after 100 or 200, we begin to feel not quite. We may have brain fog, maybe we feel anxious, maybe we feel depressed. We feel maybe just not quite as much energy as we had before. It manifests in different ways for different people. And I think a lot of the times it's like, the frogs in the pot that's slowly boiling. We just don't know. We don't notice it. And pretty soon more has happened than we'd realized. That's for
Boy,
sure.
I totally agree. It's so easy to get caught in that trap. I think we got caught in that trap a little bit over the last couple of years. But one of the anatomical realities, and I think I'm at least in the ballpark here, but you can correct me on this, but it's my understanding there's about 100 billion neurons in the human brain with about 10,000 connections each. Is that somewhere in the ballpark?
That's my understanding as well. And
And,
And one of the most important parts about brain health that is a fairly recent discovery is that our brain is always not only making new connections, which is brain plasticity, and we've known about for some time, but it's also making new brain cells. For a long time, they thought that the brain it reached a certain point in early 20s, and then it was just a slow die off after that. And then they realized actually we make new brain cells throughout our entire lifetime. Up until the very day we die, we're making new brain cells. And at first, they didn't know the importance of this discovery, but then they discovered that it has a lot to do, that our rate of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, that is the rate at which we are making new brain cells and new connections, has a lot to do with our cognitive capacity and with our emotional resilience. They did an experiment with mice where they increased their neurogenic rate 5 times. And they produced not quite super mice, but kind of like that. Turns out those mice had big cognitive advantages over their normal neurogenic rate peers. They learned faster, they figured things out faster, they were more creative, and they were more emotionally resilient. They were protected against anxiety, stress, depression. Turns out the same thing is true for human beings as well. When our neurogenic rate slows down, that is when the brain slows its growth process, right? In psychology, the reason people come into therapy is because they're in pain. And the reason they're in pain generally is because they're stuck. They aren't growing. They are stuck in different ways. And a big part of what psychotherapy tries to do is to look at the ways people are stuck so they can get moving again. They can get growing again. That this growth process it's part of what mental health is. Like when we are growing, we feel good. We feel like we're moving forward. There's a kind of resilience, there's a kind of excitement about life. When we stop growing, when we slow our growth, then we begin to get symptoms. And the same is true of the brain, it turns out. When the brain's growth slows down, we get anxiety, depression, and cognitive decline, brain fog, because there are common neural mechanisms underneath anxiety, depression, and cognitive decline. There are very different psychological processes. And so it's ideally we can work with both the psychological dimension and the physical brain health dimension.
Okay.
Usually it's just one or the other. So we're trying to really work with both ideally.
So it causes me to ask a question I wasn't really thinking about before the interview started, but when you consider the prefrontal cortex or the limbic system, do you notice any differences in cognitive decline anatomically or physiologically, neurophysiologically, when we start talking about peak brain performance or cognitive enhancement? Is there different areas of the brain that are a little bit more susceptible one way or another?
It turns out that the hippocampus is the part that is most involved in neurogenesis. The entire brain is involved with neuroplasticity, or what's called synaptogenesis, right?
Okay.
New connections among existing neurons. So the entire brain does that. And so whatever we're learning, that part of the brain and the entire brain is involved in creating that. But the hippocampus is the part that is involved with neurogenesis, the creation of new brain cells.
Okay.
The hippocampus is a very interesting part of the brain. It's a crescent moon shaped structure. Actually, there's two. We have one on each side of the brain. We have two hippocampi, but it's usually referred to in the singular. And the hippocampus, one end of it is responsible for processing new memories. And so Alzheimer's, for example, massively attacks the hippocampus. And so people start losing the capacity to make new memories. And when the memory system begins to go, the whole sense of self begins to, it's like the rug gets pulled out from the whole sense of self.
Okay.
Sense of self is really dependent upon memory. So when we stop making new memories, that's when we get real cognitive decline.
Okay.
The other part of the hippocampus, the other part of the crescent moon, is involved with emotion regulation, particularly the regulation of anxiety, stress, and depression. So ideally what we want is we want high neurogenic rate along the entire length of the hippocampus. So antidepressant medication, for example, SSRIs, they don't work by increasing serotonin. It's not like people who are depressed have a low serotonin levels. That's what most people think, and that's what pharmaceutical companies have been pushing for many years, but it's actually not true. People who are depressed, most studies show they have normal serotonin levels. Some studies show they actually have higher than normal serotonin levels, and a few show lower, but most show average. It turns out that when you increase different neurotransmitters, you boost the neurogenic rate. And it's this neurogenic rate boost that gets people out of depression.
Okay.
So when taking an SSRI simply increases the neurogenic rate among the emotional side of the hippocampus, not the cognitive side. So you don't get a cognitive boost, but you get some more emotional resilience.
Okay.
And there are, I think both books go into probably 30 or 40 different natural supplements and nutrients that also increase our neurogenic rate quite dramatically and don't have the side effects that antidepressants do.
Gotcha.
Side effects of loss of libido, emotional blunting, other things like that.
Gotcha. And I do want to circle back onto those, tips on how to stimulate better neurogenesis. But maybe let's go into a little bit of what causes some of the actual decline. What are the exposures that we face? And I know there are many that have a negative impact on brain health, neurogenesis.
Yeah, it's huge. We live in an incredibly neurotoxic environment, and we've kind of stumbled into this. Nobody really knew that so many of the toxins in our environment affect the brain like they do and reduce the neurogenic rate. So smog, for example, most of the world's population lives in smoggy areas. Smog, particularly the very tiny 2-micron and smaller particles,
Particulates.
they enter the lungs, take into the bloodstream, and they actually cross the blood-brain barrier and enter the brain, where they act like little wrecking balls with the delicate tissues of the brain. Creates inflammation, oxidation. We know that inflammation is behind most of the major chronic diseases: cancer, Alzheimer's, heart disease, diabetes, you name it.
Right.
Inflammation is also involved with cognitive decline, with dementia. So some people believe that 30% of Alzheimer's can simply be tracked to smog, high smog levels. If you live in a smoggy environment, really good to get a very good air filter for at least indoor living. Glyphosate, the herbicide in Roundup, the most widely used herbicide in the world. In the United States, 300 million pounds of it are used every year. Huge amounts are used in China, Brazil, India. Glyphosate is, first of all, it's an antibiotic. And so it wipes out our microbiome, the bacteria in our gut, which we
gut health
disaster. And there's a lot more to be said about that. But it also opens up the tight junctions of the intestines. Now, the tight junctions of the intestines are what keeps out the bad stuff, but lets in the good stuff. So when those tight junctions open up, all sorts of toxins begin to come into the body, creating inflammation, creating leaky gut.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out that the tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier respond to the same molecular signals as that of the gut. So when the gut's tight junctions open up, so do those of the brain, letting in toxins into the brain. So we get leaky gut, we get leaky brain, and then we get all sorts of inflammation, oxidation, things like that. Now, UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, did a nationwide study a few years ago and found out that 93% of Americans have measurable levels of glyphosate in their system. Probably by now, it's even well above that.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you eat purely organically and live in a very clean part of the United States, probably you have some degree of glyphosate toxicity. Therefore, you have some degree of leaky brain, leaky gut, and all these things, inflammation, oxidation, they reduce the neurogenic rate dramatically. Again, when that rate goes down, stress levels goes up, anxiety levels go up, depression, brain fog, cognitive decline. Plastics, these forever chemicals, these are endocrine disruptors, dramatic effects on reducing the neurogenic rate, creating inflammation. We could spend this entire show just looking at the minefield of daily life. Daily life is hard to navigate without stepping into some of these things. If you eat oats, even organic oats, all oats that have been tested have glyphosate. It's everywhere. It's in conventional meat because they are fed high glyphosate foods. So
I know I was
our environment. Oh, and one more thing. So
sure.
There's this physical dimension, but there's also emotional toxicity. Stress, particularly. Producing high levels of stress hormones, glucocorticoids, also produces inflammation, reduces the neurogenic rate of the brain. Being lonely, this has a profound impact on the brain, as well as our emotional health as well. We can also talk about mental and spiritual neurotoxins as well, but we've got limited time here, so let's stick to this.
Well, I appreciate that. There's so many toxins, and we haven't even talked about aluminum or mercury or some of the other heavy metal exposures. I know the glyphosate conversation is huge, and even the non-GMO. I wasn't aware of this until recently. The non-GMO agricultural reality includes glyphosate because many times they use glyphosate to speed the plant to its maturation so that they can get the crop in before winter hits. And so you've got glyphosate even in those agricultural products like corn and soy and chickpea and all those different agricultural realities. So it's just everywhere. And then the biofuel exposure to glyphosate, the ethanol. So you go back to what you started out with is the pollution factor. That not only is there's all kinds of things in pollution, and it includes glyphosate because we're burning ethanol. So
that's right, cotton, and GMO cotton, high levels. So tampons, for example, women can get high levels of glyphosate simply from tampons.
Right, and I think that's and it's one of those things when you look back 100 years ago, before it was so prevalent, you could say, well, we just didn't know.
Yeah.
But there's just no excuse today.
That's right. Most people don't know, but the people who should be guarding against these things, they do know. That's right.
That's a good distinction.
This whole thing of regulatory capture, right? That so many of the institutions we think are going to protect us are actually part and parcel of the very problem that they're supposed to be regulating. Yeah.
Yeah. And we could spend a little bit more time on that as well. So essentially, why don't we switch into a little bit more on the stress and fear. You just started to touch on that a little bit. Maybe expand that a little bit more and how that impacts the decrease in. Is it related to cortisol or other chemicals in the body?
Exactly. So, we talk about stress as if it's simply a bad thing, but there's actually good stress as well.
Mm-hmm.
Optimal stress is short term and moderate. And when we are stressed in that kind of a way, generally it means that we are challenged by life. And we respond to that challenge by bringing forth new potentials, new possibilities. We meet that challenge in some way, and we use our brain, we use ourself, and bring forth a new response to meet that challenge. And that is actually good for us. That is helpful. We get stronger through that kind of thing. In the same way that we stress a muscle when we exercise or lift a weight or something, and then we stop, the muscle grows back stronger.
Mm-hmm.
It's helpful to have that kind of stress. But the kind of stress most people complain of is not that, it's chronic stress. It's either high levels of stress or chronic stress. And that produces high levels of glucocorticoids in the body. And glucocorticoid levels, when they are chronic like that, damage just about every organ system we know of.
Mm-hmm.
They damage the cardiovascular system, they damage the gut, they damage the endocrine system, but they also powerfully affect the brain. Again, they create inflammation, they slow down the neurogenic rate. High levels of stress, very high levels of stress, actually can kill brain cells, actually can kill cells in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is involved in regulating glucocorticoid levels. So it becomes a kind of vicious cycle. The higher the stress levels, the less the possibility of even regulating those very levels become. High stress levels are very damaging to the brain. Super high stress levels can actually kill 1/4 of the hippocampus.
Oof.
Which is pretty amazing when you think about it. I mean,
Huge.
it's saying you don't have one of the 4 chambers of your heart. I mean, it's gigantic. And so your capacity then to deal with stressful events is much reduced after that. You're on kind of hyper alert after that.
You just can't get out of the sympathetic state.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And so that's why I think this whole idea of neurogenesis is so hopeful, because the hippocampus can begin to regenerate, right? Because that is where the neurogenic process, the neurogenesis process happens. And so I think anybody who's experiencing stress of any kind would do well to see if they can increase their neurogenic rate to begin to deal with that stress, as well as looking at ways that they can begin to reduce that stress in their lives.
Excellent. And it's probably a good little segue into, what are some of the brain health steps? I know you touched on SSRIs, and I think that you had shared at least at some point that the pharmaceutical was or still is, or more, probably more in 2022. But a few years ago, they were at $16 billion a year. And, so it's quite a profit-driven approach, and it's kind of that quick fix, that people are kind of lured into, unfortunately, and it's really not a great fix. So but there is hope, and that you kind of just touched on it, is that the body's always rebuilding, repairing itself, and a lot of people, when they come into my office, they think, well, I'm this age or that age, or there's no hope. And it's like, well, no, your anatomical reality is still very young. There's not much in your body that's very old. It's how well is it rebuilding and repairing itself. So what are the brain health steps that you've outlined? And I know you've got about a 4-step process that you've outlined that help give people that hope that, no, really, you can get new brain cells that are much better for you.
So I think of this as there's a big diet and physical brain health piece, and then there's also a psychological piece as well.
Okay.
So in terms of what I think of as the healthy brain diet, I think it consists of 4 different pillars: neurogenic, ketogenic or low carb, anti-inflammatory, and gut-friendly. All four of these are involved with brain health.